All right. Good morning, everybody. Sorry about the tardiness here and the craziness. This, of course, would be the one day that our projector goes out. It's literally the worst class for that to happen because the whole thing is maps and pictures that I have for you guys. So it would have been really hard to be, describing, imagine the Mediterranean Sea. It's like that. It's not going to go well. So here's our new screen. I know it's a little harder for you guys to see than obviously higher up there, but hopefully you'll be able to see it well enough. So let's go to God in prayer. We're going to need extra prayers for this class. Father in heaven, we praise your name. Thank you for the opportunity to come together as your family. We're grateful to partake the Lord's Supper and to be goaded to remind ourselves of the sacrifice of your Son that gives life meaning and helps us continue moving in the right direction to be more like him. Just so grateful for all of your blessings. Be with us as we study your word this morning. Help us to be transformed by this amazing adventure that we read about in Acts 27. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Paul's initial round of trials is finally over after appealing to stand trial before Caesar. And we get to read now about this incredibly wild ride that Paul has on the way to Rome. This journey will not be smooth sailing for Paul at all. And Jesus, though, has assured him back in Acts 23 that he will reach Rome. But little does Paul know the crazy adventure that awaits him to get there. It's important to understand this is a pivotal movement in the book of Acts. I should say a pivotal moment in the movement of the book of Acts. In volume 1, which is Luke's gospel, he traced the movement of Jesus' work from Galilee to Jerusalem. And then in Acts, it's about the movement of Jesus' work from Jerusalem to Rome. And as you recall, Luke has been drawing parallels between Jesus and Paul ever since and even before Paul's arrival in Jerusalem. And I think here in Acts 27, we see another parallel with Jesus' life in that it's kind of a parallel with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Paul, he goes into the heart of the sea, just the heart of darkness and despair and terror and hopelessness, and yet he emerges alive and victorious and reaches his goal of Rome. It's important to appreciate this isn't just any story about a shipwreck. The nautical detail given here is unparalleled in ancient history. One scholar said there is no such detailed record of the working of an ancient ship in the whole of classical literature. And interestingly, Luke is not a sailor, he is a doctor. So he will use terminology that is not really the exact terminology that sailors would use, but impossible to have described unless he had been there. This is what another scholar, James Smith, he's a expert in seamanship and navigation. He wrote this: no sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. But no man not a sailor could have written a narrative of a sea voyage so consistent in all its parts unless from actual observation. So we learn in Acts 27 and verse 1 that Luke is actually with Paul because it says it was decided that we would sail for Italy. Anytime you see those we sections in Luke or us, that means Luke is there with him. So Luke is on this voyage with Paul, watching all these things firsthand. And in fact, the last we section that we saw in Acts was way back in Acts 21:17, which was 2 years ago at this point. Question, what's kind of the general consensus about what Luke was doing for the 2 years that Paul was in prison in Caesarea? Okay, yeah, so potentially he was writing the Gospel of Luke, and there was something I think that needed to happen before he actually wrote that Gospel, which was what? Yeah, he would have been traveling through Israel, collecting eyewitness accounts of Jesus so that he could write the Gospel of Luke. And when you read, and I'm saving time because we've got a late start, but if you read Luke chapter 1, you see he describes to Theophilus, look, I have undergone, great effort to put together and compile all these eyewitness accounts about Jesus. So Luke was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Didn't mean there was no work involved on Luke's part. This class will be a little different in that I'm going to go through the details of this story. I'm going to leave you time for comments and questions throughout, but if you have comments about practical application, hold those, write those down, because I want to spend the last part of our class, and I'm going to do class differently. We should have between 5 and 10 minutes to just talk about practical application at the end. But I want to make sure that we get the flow of the narrative, what's happening in this story. And if you have comments or questions about the details of the story along the way, please feel free to make those. So now we have Acts 27, 1 through 8, from Caesarea to Fair Havens. Here is an overview map of the whole trip. So, well, wow, that's reflecting off into Mike Allen's eye. Okay. Let's see. Let me try to angle it a little bit better. Yeah, okay, it's on the wall over there. All right, so Caesarea, all the way over. I can use my finger. I can do that. All right, so I'm 2 feet away. I'm using a laser pointer. All right. So Caesarea to Rome. Very good. So that's going to be the whole trip. But then if we actually zoom in on the map, we're going to have this first leg of the journey from Caesarea over here to Fair Havens. Notice there are 3 legs of this trip. From Caesarea to Sidon, and then to Sidon to Myra, and then from Myra to Fair Havens. They'll actually be changing ships in Myra. And also notice that the winds this time of year on the Mediterranean are west-northwest, which means they come from the west and from the northwest. This will help us understand why they take the routes that they do. So let's just read verses 1 through 3. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking on an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next time we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. So let's pause here for a second. On this first leg, they're traveling in an Adramyttian ship, which would have been a coastal trading vessel that stayed local. It's from the city, you can see here, of Adramyttian up north. And probably it would have just traveled along the coast here, stopping at various ports for trade and commerce. And what's happened is it's come all the way down here to its southernmost route, and they're hopping on that ship as it's traveling its way back up the coast, back home to Adramyttian. That was a famous shipbuilding city there. And since Paul was a Roman citizen, he received some special treatment. And he gets to take his friends Aristarchus and Luke along with him. What would have been nice about having Luke with them on this trip? Yeah, he's a doctor, right? That's just a great thing to have, right, on a sea voyage. And Julius, he's the centurion. He played a special imperial role of some kind. We're not 100% sure. Some people think that he would have escorted Festus down to Caesarea to start his governorship, and then he and his men are going to go back now to Rome after escorting Festus there. Here are some pictures of what an ancient cargo ship looked like back then. This one is a model that you can find today in the Malta Maritime Museum. This is a modern-day replica someone built. You can see here that there's a center mast where they raised the mainsail, and then on the front of the ship was a foresail. So it was just a smaller sail. And then at the back, you have the rudder with 2 oars, one on either side of the ship. Here's a close-up. Can you guys see that? I don't want to block the podium. So there's a close-up of the rudder on the back of the ship. And then here is the view from the front there. You can kind of see the foresail. Of course, they don't have the sails up there. Here's an artistic rendering of having all the sails up, what that might look like. Now, these pictures, unfortunately, they make the ships look kind of small, but they varied in sizes. And some of these ships, the biggest size that I read about was 186 feet long. So take an 18-story building, flip it down on its side, and you're talking about a massive ship, which is helpful to know because later we're going to learn there are 276 people on board this ship that Paul's taking. And that really shouldn't surprise us in terms of, could it really hold that many people? Yeah, it absolutely could. As far as cargo, they could hold between 10 and 1,100 tons of weight. Now, in contrast to Paul, many of these men on board with him are prisoners, probably who have already been condemned as guilty. and they're being shipped off to Rome as slaves to be used in the gladiatorial games. The Roman Coliseum was not built yet. It wasn't built until 70 AD. But Rome, already long before the Coliseum was built, engaged in these gladiatorial games where they made prisoners fight to the death, fight each other to the death. They would fight wild animals to the death for people's entertainment. So that's probably where these prisoners are headed. Well, in verse 3, they arrive in Sidon, and let me see, make sure I catch up here. They arrive in Sidon, a well-known trading port, and Julius actually lets Paul off the ship to go be with his brother. I'm sure he sent, an escort of some kind. He didn't just let Paul go off by himself, but would have sent an escort, let him go be with his friends to receive care. He didn't let any of the other prisoners do that. Question, how do you think Paul received care from his friends and his brethren there in Sidon? What do you think that means? Various things.
I believe it means money to sustain him.
Okay, yeah, maybe they gave him some money, right, to sustain him on the trip. Well, I was using the word receive because it says he went to his friends and to receive care. At least that's what the New American Standard says in verse 3. Yeah, so maybe they gave him money. Yeah, what else do you think? How else would they have cared for Paul?
Let him get some food.
Okay, yeah, maybe send him with some food, some clothing. Probably, they're Christians. They're going to pray together, right? They're going to try to encourage Paul. Yeah, maybe sing together.
Study the Bible.
Yeah. Break out their New Testaments and study. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, they're going to talk about God's Word together, encourage each other. Yeah, absolutely. This is really a wonderful demonstration of Christian love and a great source of strength for Paul. Yeah, Jack?
They would probably try and get him some seaworthy garments that would repel water better.
Okay, yeah, maybe so. Maybe they're giving him some better garments for seafaring that can repel, water better. Yeah, Terry?
The thorn in his side would be very helpful.
Okay, yeah. We don't know what the thorn of the side is, but if it was some medical issue, they're maybe helping him with that. Yeah, really good. I mean, I just think this would have been really encouraging for Paul to be able to meet with his brethren before this harrowing trip. Of course, he doesn't really know how harrowing it's going to be at this point. But verses 4 through 8, let's just read that here, verse 4 through 8. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus or Cnidus, there's a debate over the translation there, since the wind did not permit us to go any further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So they used the island of Cyprus as a shield for the wind. Now, of course, on a map, the shorter route would be to go directly from Caesarea over to Myra, but remember those winds. They would be sailing directly into those winds from the northwest, so they can't do that. They have to go north. They have to travel and allow the island of Cyprus to kind of block those winds. And the other neat thing is there were actually currents that ran westward underneath Asia Minor. So they would be able, yes, once they got past Cyprus, they'd be kind of going straight into the wind, but they would also have that current working for them. So it was a slow trip. It would have been a slog. They would have gone a few miles, and if the wind got too bad, they'd probably have to take a break and then move a little bit further. Probably took them about 15 days. There's just some debate about how quickly they would have been able to go. Apparently those Alexandrian ships, when fully loaded, would be going like 9 miles per hour. So that's not really, very fast. And some of these situations that they found themselves in, they would have been going like 1 mile an hour on this trip. So, I mean, it was a slog in a lot of these sections. Well, when they arrived in Myra, that's where they changed ships. Now, I don't think the design of the ship would have changed. Maybe it was a little bigger. But the main difference is its destination. The ship that they're on right now, remember, it's going up north to Adramyttium, but they need to go west to Rome. So they change ships. And this ship is called an Alexandrian ship because it came from Alexandria, Egypt. Egypt was the main supplier of grain for Rome. So this Alexandrian ship was a grain ship. And, again, because of you'd think, okay, well, if you're, going to Rome from Alexandria, why don't you just like go this way? Well, they can't because of the wind. And so they have to travel north to Myra first at this point. So Luke says from Myra, they sailed with difficulty, he says, to Cnidus here. With difficulty. It makes sense because they're going straight into the wind there. Very difficult travel. Let me make sure I'm tracking here. Yeah, so then he says, once we got to Cnidus, he says the wind would not allow us to travel any further. You can see that because there's no landmass here anymore. At least here they were kind of traveling under the shelter of the land, but now they're just out in the open sea. They can't go any further into those winds, so they have to kind of just allow themselves to be driven across by the wind. And now what they want to do is take shelter under the island of Crete. Well, Luke says, with much difficulty we sailed past this area, because what happens is, yes, you are sheltered from all the winds here, but now you have no wind. And you're on a sailboat. And so you really just don't have much power. And that's why they probably would have been going like 1 mile an hour, just really slogging it to try to get here to Fair Havens. They finally arrive here in Fair Havens. And now there's going to be a disagreement about what to do next. But any questions or comments so far just about the details of the trip? If you got any, super practical life application, just hold on to that. We're going to get to that at the end. But any questions or comments so far? Okay. So the crew now is going to ignore Paul's advice. Look in verse 9 through 13. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to the men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our own lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close in shore. So it's important to know they are already in sail at your own risk season. Verse 9 says the fast was already over. This is a reference to the Jewish Day of Atonement. That would have been October 5th in the year 59 AD. That means they are already in the danger zone for sailing, and Paul thinks what we need to do is just hunker down here in Fair Havens and ride out the winter. So if you're talking about sailing schedules, September 14th through November 11th, that was the danger zone. That was the sail at your own risk zone. They are already into October, so they're in the danger zone. But starting November 11th to March 10th, you're not sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. Nobody with any sanity is going to be sailing on the sea. It's just too dangerous in the winter on the sea. So they're really not having a discussion at all right now about whether to go to Rome. They don't want to go to Rome right now. They're just trying to figure out, okay, where can we spend the winter and then go to Rome once the winter's over? Well, Paul says I really think we should stay here in Fair Havens, because if we keep pushing on, we're going to lose our ship, we're going to lose our cargo, probably going to lose our own lives here. But in fairness, if you notice on a map here, Fair Havens is kind of exposed to most southern points on a compass. So it's very exposed to a lot of different angles, and the crew doesn't really feel safe about staying there. They want to go to Phoenix, which is farther west here, which is actually going to be a little bit more sheltered than Fair Havens is. And so they decide, they actually have a bit of a change in wind. There's actually a little bit of a south wind that starts coming. And so they say, we think we can make it. Let's just go to Phoenix and see how this goes. Well, what happens as they start heading that way? We didn't read this section out loud in the text, but what happens when they start heading that way? to Phoenix. Yeah, there's this giant storm that comes down upon them called Euraquilo. It's like a cyclonic wind that rushes down the mountains of Crete. This was a very common occurrence, so much so they had a nickname for it, Euraquilo, which just means violent northeastern wind. The mountains of Crete were 7,000 feet tall, and when the cold air of the mountains rushed down and mixed with the warm air of the sea, kind of like on the Sea of Galilee, I mean, storms could just pop up like that. And this is just a horrendous storm, just violent waves, rain. The ship is just being battered, tossed around. The only chance they have now is to go in the direction of the wind. They can't go to Phoenix anymore. They just have to let themselves be pushed in the direction of the wind. And they actually catch a tiny little break, because when they come around the island of Cauda, or Clauda, or Cauda, or Clauda, I don't know why there's multiple. I've tried to look up, like, why do they have multiple names for these things? I thought it was just misspellings at first. It's not. They're just alternate names, Clauda or Cauda. But anyway, they reach this island, and now they actually have a little bit of shelter here from the terrible winds because of this island. And they take this opportunity, now that they have a little bit of a window of reprieve, to do some things with the ship. What do? I've got about 5 things that they did with the ship here under the shelter. Okay, yeah, so they took cables and they wrapped the ship around with cables. And that would, of course, hold the ship together and keep it from cracking. There's some debate about, did they do it horizontally around the ship, or did they go from front to back as well, to keep the back from breaking? Maybe they did both, but you get the idea. It would have kept the wood planks together on the ship. Yeah. What else? Okay, yeah, so it says they lowered an anchor. There's debate about that, verse 17, what exactly they did there. But yeah, one understanding of it is they lowered an anchor so that the ship wouldn't be so violently tossed by the wind. They would maybe be able to get the ship under a little bit more control. Okay, so yeah, what else did they do? Yeah, they lightened the ship. Okay, they threw out, whatever they didn't need, they tossed aside. They threw cargo overboard. And if you make the ship lighter, that keeps the ship from taking on more water. It makes it a little more agile on the waves. The waves don't have as much of an effect if the ship is lighter. Yeah, absolutely. Some suggest the idea of, I think it's the verse about verse 17, about the anchor, is that what they did was they threw the main mast over the side. That they didn't need the main mast and the main sail. And in fact, it was dangerous, because if you have wind putting all that pressure on the main mast in the center of the ship, it can really, break the back of the ship, break its spine essentially. Right? So they just tossed that overboard. Also, they hoist the lifeboat up onto the deck. There's like a dinghy that's just hanging off the side of the boat, and they say, we can't get that thing under control. It's just, the water's, filling it up. It's probably slamming against the side of the ship, and they have to hoist that thing back up. And Luke says, with much difficulty, we hoisted that thing back up. Can you imagine if it's full of water? Of course, it's difficult. They pull that thing and put it up on the deck. Yeah, so they're taking advantage here. And also, it's important to understand, they are headed for the fear of all Mediterranean sailors, and that is the shifting sandbars that are found southwest of the island of Crete, called the Greater Syrtis and the Lesser Syrtis. They're headed toward the Greater Syrtis, so they are terrified they're going to run aground. That's part of the reason why they're lightening the ship as well, because they don't want to get stuck on this sandbar. So they get a little bit of reprieve from the storm, but they're going to be right back in it. It's been about 11 days now, and with a battered ship, they're just, oh man, it's nighttime. They're just flying blind. Even in the daytime, they can't see anything because the clouds are so thick. They can't see the sun, can't see the moon, can't see the stars, and they're plunged into darkness and discouragement and despair. Look in verse 20. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. So just dejected, utterly hopeless, or so they thought. Paul encourages the crew now with a word from God. Let's look in verse 21. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island.'" Let me say, I don't think the point is Paul's just being snarky here and saying, "See, told you so. You should have listened to me." I think he's just trying to get them to take him seriously. I mean, it is a fact. I don't think he's rubbing it in their faces. I think it's just a fact. You should have listened to what I said. Question, does Paul have any experience sailing on the Mediterranean Sea? Yes. Yes. Somebody clocked his travels on the missionary journeys, 3,500 miles on the sea. And as Mary just mentioned, he actually mentioned in 2 Corinthians, he's been in 3 shipwrecks already, before this one. So he knows exactly the crazy stuff that can happen on the Mediterranean Sea. And he knows exactly when people are doing dumb things that end up getting you shipwrecked. And so you can see why, in his wisdom, he's saying, we probably should have just stayed at Fairhaven and just, cut our losses and just been content for the winter there. They didn't listen. And hopefully now Paul has their attention. And Paul tells them, take courage, because an angel of God came to me, told me, we will reach Rome. And not just me. I'm not the only one who's going to reach Rome. Everybody on the ship is going to reach Rome. Do not be afraid. And by the 14th night of being lost at sea, they hear waves breaking off into the distance. And they think, hey, we're getting close to land here. They can't see where they are at all. But what they do is they take soundings to see how far away they are, see how deep the ship is, how shallow the waters are. And they would take a rope and they would tie knots in a rope every 6 feet. And that was called a fathom. And they would drop that rope down with weights into the sea, and then they'd pull it back up and see how many of the knots were wet in order to get a reading. Well, the first time they did that, the reading was 120 feet, 20 fathoms. Well, then they did it again a little bit later, and it was 90 feet. So they could tell, actually, the water is getting more and more shallow, which means we're coming up closer to landmass. But the problem is they can't see anything. It's nighttime. And so they're worried, if we keep going, we might run aground on rocks. So they say, let's just stop right here. Let's drop all our anchors, and let's just not move until we get some daylight, until we can actually see where we're going. And so that's what they do. Well, while they're waiting, what idea do some of the sailors get? Yes, this is our time to escape. Let's take that lifeboat, right? Let's put that thing in the water and get going. Well, Paul finds out about this, and he goes and he tells Julius about it. He says, look, they cannot take that ship. If you think about it just from a logical perspective, if all the professional sailors leave the ship, we're in trouble. If they do this, Paul says, you cannot be saved. And so they go, Julius catches them. They actually cut that lifeboat off. They just cut it away. I suppose they could have just, hauled it back in the ship, but if they kept it around, who's to say the sailors wouldn't try again? So they just cut that thing away. They don't even have the option to abandon ship anymore. And you can imagine that tensions are probably running a little high right now, knowing that these sailors just abandoned you to die. And so you have a lot of just wide range of emotions going on here. And now Paul, again, is an encouragement and a light. He encourages the crew to eat. Verse 33, until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. And all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. So they they couldn't really do anything but wait for daylight at this point. And Paul says, here's a perfect opportunity. Yeah, I assume they have some reprieve, some lull in the storm at this point. And Paul says, look, it's been 14 days. None of us have eaten. And I imagine this is helping to kind of relieve the tension too. We're all, we're all at each other's throats right now. And we just need to take this time to get some food. So they do that. And if you think about it, it's been all hands on deck. I mean, just nonstop watching and being on the alert. There hasn't been any time to eat. Hasn't been any energy to eat. And if any of you have ever been seasick, you don't really want to eat. You don't really feel like it. And can you imagine being tossed around at sea for 14 days straight? How much you would really be wanting to eat throughout those 14 days. Now that things have kind of calmed down, Paul says, let's go ahead and eat. And he offers thanks for this food. They're all encouraged together. And they have this huge shift in attitude now from the despair and the hopelessness and the fear and all that to now they're gaining strength. They're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. They're nearing land. They know land is nearby. They can't see it yet, but they know it's there. And Paul has told them God is going to preserve you. So they've got some hope again. And now they end up throwing, remember it's a grain ship, so they throw the grain overboard. And you think, well, why in the world would they do that? Well, because right now their main priority is to save themselves. They're not sure if they're going to, preserve the ship at all, but they have to make the ship as light as possible because they're going to try to run the ship aground. And they're really lightening it up at this point. Any comments or questions just about the details so far before we get to 39? Yeah, Terry?
Without touching on the practical application.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm just amazed by the leadership that Paul has in all of the situations.
Mm-hmm.
The person who should be trying to work on the morale and calm everyone down and prioritize should be the captain. And here, some prisoner is basically taking the leadership role and saying, this is what we need to do and raising morale.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because Paul has God on his side, he's able to be the leader. The leader that everybody else is failing to be. Yeah, really good. All right. Well, they're finally going to reach the land in this section. I think I'm behind on my clicking. Give me 1 second here. There we go. They finally reached land. Verse 39, when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders, hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where the two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. We don't know with 100% certainty this is exactly where they landed on the island of Malta, but the traditional site today is known as St. Paul's Bay. It's called St. Paul's Bay for that reason, because it is believed traditionally that this is the site where they landed on the island of Malta. And again, alternate spelling, Waldron's map has Melita, and I thought, why? What is going on here? But it's just an alternate spelling, Malta or Melita. This is where it's believed that they landed. And that's where Acts 27 ends, is here on Malta. They're not in Rome yet. Obviously, they have more to go, but they're on Malta here. And when daylight came, they saw land. They saw Malta, but they didn't really recognize it. And so they cut the anchors loose, and they lowered the rudders back into the water so that they could steer. And then they raised that sail on the front of the ship to use that to drive them up onto the beach. But while they're moving, they end up hitting a sandbar, and the front of the ship gets stuck in the sandbar, but the back of the ship is not. And so the front is stuck, and the back of the ship is being, hit by waves, and it starts to just break up. So they know it's over. They're going to lose the ship. And the soldiers, they have a plan. They say, we need to kill the prisoners. Why would they be so invested in killing the prisoners.
Because if the prisoner escapes, their lives are forfeited.
Yeah, definitely. If they escape, that's on them. They can be killed for allowing their prisoners to escape. But the problem is, if they go through with this plan, who else dies? Paul. And Julius says, no. Not killing Paul. Not going to happen. And so he has a better plan. And the plan is, the text doesn't exactly say this, but I'm pretty positive this is what's happening. He's telling the soldiers who know how to swim to go first, so that the soldiers will be on the beach, so that when the prisoners come, the soldiers can round them up as they land on the beach. And that's what happens. He says, if you can swim, great. If you can't, you can float on pieces of the wreckage of the ship. And they finally get there to safety. Well, let's talk for the rest of the class. We have 8 minutes, all right, to talk about practical applications. What lessons can we learn? What did you find helpful or encouraging to your life as a Christian in this account? I have 8 things, so I know there's a lot to talk about. So if you don't have anything, I've got 8. So, but I'm sure yours will overlap with mine. What do you got?
Always listen to the person who says he's talking from God, at least at first.
Well, yeah, I would say in the days of the apostles, that would be a good idea. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, today who say God's talking to them. Probably shouldn't listen to them. But yeah, Paul was an apostle. And I think that's a great lesson here, that you need to listen to the inspired apostles or things will be disastrous. When they ignored the inspired apostle Paul's instructions, they just plunged deeper into, darkness and death and despair, and things just got worse. Listen to the apostles. Yeah, Herb?
God never promised Paul that life would be easy. He just promised he'd be with him, and that's the same way for us.
Yeah.
We're going to have horrible storms in our life. But that's not because God has abandoned us. It's because God is letting His power be revealed as He wants.
Yeah, really good. He never promised Paul's life would be easy, but he did say, I'm going to be with you. Don't be afraid, because I have a plan for you. I'm going to be with you all the way. Yeah, that's really good. Mary?
I was thinking they knew the land was there, but they didn't know how they were going to get there, and they couldn't see it. So that was the time for them to wait and pray and keep up their spirits, keep up their energy by eating.
Yeah.
So there is a time to just wait and pray rather than jump in and do something.
Yeah, really good. I like that. So they couldn't see at first where the land was. They heard the waves breaking. They knew land was nearby, but instead of just diving in and doing something foolish, it's wise sometimes to just pause and pray and take strength and encouragement where you can. Yeah, I like that. Matt?
What just struck me this morning, hearing in 34 section, the way Paul deals with the kind of bad behavior. It's not that they don't need correction. We don't have every word recorded, obviously, but it doesn't seem like he was lecturing and scolding, and you guys shouldn't do this, and you're leaving us, and this isn't right. And he actually says the opposite. Come on, let's get some food. We can do better. We're just together. And we see that God does that with whether it's ourselves or kids, each other, better approach when someone's maybe not doing right to say, well, you can do better.
Yeah.
I'm going to help you. Let's do this together. It's encouraging and uplifting instead of,
Yeah.
you just cut that out.
Absolutely. Yeah, Paul's leadership style, he was very motivating. Let's just do better. He was very patient. He didn't just say, how come you won't listen to me? I'm telling you, don't leave Fairhaven. If you do this, it's a big mistake. Why don't you ever, nobody ever listens to me. This is he didn't do any of that.
So what allowed Paul to be able to do that?
Well, I think just trusting the Lord and knowing He can control people.
Amen.
And we want to control people. What's that?
Accepting his big mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure. Yeah. Accepting the fact that some people they just have to make their own mistakes to learn. They won't learn from your mistakes. They'll learn from their own. Yeah, Terry.
Talk about kicking against the goat.
When they were going and they knew the storm was coming, they could have stayed there and they were going. But one thing that they did do that I think the application from is when the winds came down from mountains, they didn't keep trying to force themselves up to Phoenix. They just went with it. And sometimes in life, you just kind of have to let the bad time ride out and have faith in God that He's going to be with you and keep you through it.
Yeah, really good. So kicking against the goads, they could have just kept pressing against the wind, but they decided, look, we just have to roll with it and just go where the wind takes us right now, even though we don't really want to go there. But it is what it is. and you just have to navigate it that way. Yeah, Ryan?
I think it's fantastic to see how Paul takes this as an opportunity to talk about God. He
Yeah.
says many times that the agent of God came to me. He blesses God before they eat the food, but he does so in a way that loves, offers, serves, and teaches the people, even given the incredibly strenuous circumstances that they're in.
Yeah, how awesome, how unashamed Paul is in front of all these non-Christians to own God and to pray to God. And I mean, it would have just been clear to think about the influence on the prisoners now. They would never forget that shipwreck and that adventure, because they would know, man, God was with us because God was with Paul. And we want to know this God. Yeah, really good. Debbie?
But they still told that no one's going to die, and so I think we can apply that we trust God's promises to help us get through scary times.
Yeah, definitely.
Trust in Him that there's a reward at the end.
Yeah, really good. I mean, there's a definite parallel between this and the fact that some of us are going to go through Acts 27 times where we feel confused and scared and we can't see where we're going. We have no idea what's happening, and we just feel like we're in this storm. But we can trust God that He is with us, that He always keeps His promises no matter how difficult they are. If you think about it, Paul floated to God's promise on a piece of wood. That's all he had. That's all he had left. And if we have to float to heaven on a piece of wood, so be it. We're going to get there because God keeps His promises. Yeah. Terry? And then Gail?
So I'm guilty of this too often, but sometimes we have, like the soldiers have a solution, right? Let's kill all the prisoners. We have this solution that we think that this is it for this problem, and sometimes we don't listen to other people who have a better answer.
Yeah.
Being able to humble yourselves and listen and apply it.
Yeah, our solution is not always the best. We need to listen to counsel. Yeah, Gail?
I was going to say, don't let your fear become greater than your faith, because if we let that paralyze us, then we look away from God.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't let your fear, be greater than your faith. Yeah, Paul has such great faith. Both Paul and those non-Christians, they're going through the same storm, but Paul's showing them a different way to live, a life of faith. We don't have to see where we're going to know where we're going. We don't walk by sight. We walk by faith. And that's the way it was for Paul. A couple more things I had here. Sometimes we just need to cut off temptation from our lives. I love that. They just cut that lifeboat right off. If we leave this lifeboat around, it's just going to be temptation. Somebody's just going to, use it to sin and destroy us. So let's just cut it off. I like that. I also like how, it's a small world because we're a big family. One of the greatest things about being a Christian is no matter where you go, you're going to find people that you know, people that love you, are willing to encourage you and help you on your journey. That's what Paul found there at Sidon. Those brethren came out there to help him. And let me throw this last point in. Life as a Christian is an adventure. An adventure is defined as an unusual and exciting, typically hazardous experience or activity. We may not have an adventure like the one Paul had, but it's an adventure to stand up for the faith in a faithless world. It's an adventure to try to raise kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It's an adventure to have uncomfortable conversations with people about the faith, or even uncomfortable conversations with each other in the church about how to be more like Christ. And sometimes it's painful and difficult, and sometimes we don't want to be having an adventure anymore. But we will look back, I think, one day on our lives and say, that was truly an adventure with the Lord. And He was with me all the way. So I hope that's helpful and encouraging to you. Just for fun, just think about some comparisons and contrasts between Paul and Jonah on this trip. There's some really interesting contrasts there. But thank you all so much. And you see why we needed the projector and the TV, right? There's new syllabi available in the foyer. I also sent those out via email yesterday. And there's a singing on Wednesday. Thanks so much.